I'm here with Brian Smith, and Brian is the most brilliant, knowledgeable project online expert, I think, in the world. And certainly, Brian, you have saved so many of us so many times and have been able to unlock all of the power, the features, the information, and make it so that we can bring it to other organizations around the world and be able to really make it work. And for a lot of us, Project Online has been the powerhouse, has been the most robust system in this space, and but complicated. There's a lot of nuances, a lot of tricks, a lot of quirks, and there's only a few people in the world who really spend their time diving into Project Online. But of those couple hundred, Brian, you're I think the top of the top in that, because you've been doing it from inside and helping all of us from outside for some time. So as we get started, a question: what does it mean to be a senior escalation engineer?
I mean, it does vary across Microsoft depending what product you're working on. And for project, we were always special. Project was always a special application, in that we tended to have to do a lot of stuff ourselves within our support team that perhaps SharePoint or Exchange or Windows had a whole raft of people doing. So all of our readiness, internal training, a lot of our interactions with the product group were sort of more through the sort of escalation tier, rather than having sort of a team of people that would prepare the training or do the sort of beta readiness. In essence, it tended to be like third tier support, in that you're going to get the trickiest problems. We were fortunate as the product group. So, we could just sort of walk down the corridor and knock on the door and talk to the developer that actually wrote that piece of code that's causing that customer so much pain at the moment. But yeah, escalation really meant you were dealing with the hardest problems and sort of trying to work out how to unblock that customer. About Project Online, that threw up some interesting challenges, because as a support team, we got to know our way around the databases, and we had secure processes to be able to get a customer's database in-house in a secure environment and work on it and so on. That's probably something that would never happen these days anyway, with the new levels of security and everything else that's going on. But obviously with Project Online, we didn't have access any longer to the database as such. We had, even before Project Online came out, seen that coming and added in some diagnostic views to the database, which basically meant we could run a query against customers' data which didn't actually return anything readable, which might sound not very useful, but in fact, we could still tell which tasks were in which projects and which assignments were on which tasks. We just didn't know what that task name was. We could, if the customer was willing to tell us what the task name was, we could confirm that it was the particular task we were looking at. Obviously, we've got GUIDs as well, so we can sort of look at the GUIDs and work out the same thing. So we had a few things like that, which we'd sort of pulled with us from the project server days into the Project Online days to help us do some diagnosis of what was going on behind the scenes when it was no longer that easy to get to it. So it certainly changed the job a little bit.
Now, when was the first time you came across Microsoft Project, and when you saw it, were you like, oh my God, this is the most amazing technology I've ever seen. It's incredible. This is going to change things, or was it, were you looking at the interface and trying to figure out what was going on there? And did you start on the project team when you came into Microsoft, or did you go in from another team?
Just for some sort of previous history, I used to work for a Microsoft partner in the UK, and they came very much from an accounting background. So initially I was installing Unix systems, and my accounting colleagues were coming and putting accounting platforms on top of them for various customers in the UK. That partner then moved into, if you like, the ISV space and were creating their own sort of time recording and billing system and sort of project accounting. And it was in the days when I think it's a guy called David Hofferberth had just come up with the term professional services automation, which sort of PSA. And the company I worked for, they were called Sharpest, they decided they were going to come up with a sort of a best of breed PSA solution. So they had the accounting back end. They wanted to use Microsoft Project as well, and then a CRM platform as well, and sort of pulling all these things together. So that was how they initially got involved with Project, was as a way of linking into their sort of project, into their accounting systems.
So that got
me
before you even came to Microsoft.
Yeah, this was while I was still in the UK. In fact, how I got into Microsoft was sort of related to that, because I came over to, I'd already sort of come over to Microsoft to meet up with the project people anyway, through the contacts I had with Microsoft in the UK through that partner. But at one point I came over with a couple of the directors of that company to, I guess it wasn't really a secret that we were trying to sell our timesheet software to Microsoft to use in what was going to be Project Server, which was not a thing at that point. As it turned out, they weren't so keen on the timesheet software, which was a shame, because it's probably better than what Project ended up with. But they did quite like me, so I then looked at what opportunities there might be in Microsoft, and Chris Capp was in charge at that point, and I pinged Chris and said, "Oh, I saw this job online. Do you think this would suit me?" He said, "Yeah, that would suit you. This is the hiring manager. Send him an email, CC me, blah, blah, blah." So that sort of helped, I guess, get in the door a little bit, or at least get into an interview. I mean, there's no sort of easy way in. But it did get me an interview in a team that were building what were called solution accelerators. And this was just as Project Server 2002 was coming out. And they were producing what was called the Six Sigma Accelerator. So it was basically a set of like templates and capabilities built on top of Project Server 2002 to help with Six Sigma projects. And that was a team that I eventually joined. I actually interviewed for a job with them, and also Chris had a vacancy came up in the meantime. So I actually interviewed as a PM role for Chris as well, and took the other job. I think the final interview I had with the project team was with Chris, and he said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, I think the other job suits me better than the PM role." So I ended up only getting offered the other role. Probably having said that, I was burnt my bridges. But so that was sort of how I got in, and sort of how I sort of knew about Project was really from the desktop. And I'm you wouldn't ask me ever to manage a project. In terms of using Project, I know the features, but I probably wouldn't know how to use it properly. I mean, I know how customers use it, and I know the terminology in terms of understanding what they're telling me when it's not working. But I wouldn't consider myself a real sort of expert on Project in that sense of a user of Project. So anyway, that team collapsed, and at that point, I sort of moved into support, because it seemed a good fit in terms of they needed knowledge of Project Server, and I had that knowledge, and it sort of worked out. So yeah, it was a bit of a sort of a round way, but that's sort of how I arrived where I arrived, and then they kept with it through all the various versions of Project as they sort of moved up through 2003, 2007, 2010, 2013. Project Online obviously came along somewhere in the middle there. And then Planner. I mean, I did get very, because one of the great pieces of advice I got when I first joined Microsoft, which was from another Englishman, he said, make sure you're always working on the new stuff, because for job security, I don't know if it's still the case, but certainly if you're working on the new stuff, your job tends to be a little bit safer than if you're sort of working on the old stuff and you could be sort of seen as replaceable or whatever. So I've always tried to be involved in any of the sort of beta programs that came along. So I was usually the nominated sort of beta engineer for anything to do with project, whether that's sort of server, in the beta stuff on the client, which was basically, we put a different icon on it and we've perhaps changed the colors a little bit. It's about the only updates that project saw over the last few releases. But for Project Server, obviously, there were some new features coming in very occasionally in the old days. And then Planner came along. So I was working very closely with the Planner team, and was very impressed to see sort of how that sort of went.
I'm curious, how did you learn the different capabilities? Being on the engineering team as things are building, and you're supporting it, and you're working with all the different clients around the world, the different partners and teams. How would you learn these things? And I found on my bookshelf this, and I think it's maybe time to crack open the Project Server 2003, but which is, I'm looking at it, it's like 600 pages long of detail, and oh no, my God, it's 865 pages long for Project Server 2003, Project 2003. How did you learn that detail and that information?
Now, probably slowly is the. I guess he slowly picked stuff up. I mean, it's with 2002 into 2003, there wasn't too much sort of new coming along, but in some ways it was all new. But obviously, it just getting your head around how it all worked. I think for 2002, probably the installation manual was nearly as thick as that book. But for 2003, I think it probably became easier to install. And it's just really a case of knowing the features. But I mean, the thing that I guess kept me interested in the project was that it was pretty broad in that, you weren't really just a sort of project support engineer. You had to know how Windows and Windows Server worked. You had to know how SQL Server worked. You had to know some reasonably deep stuff about how the database was hanging together. You needed to know how the OLAP reporting worked. And then you needed to know how SharePoint worked, obviously, because it was all sort of built on top of SharePoint as well. So it was, from a learning perspective, it was interesting that you got to sort of touch all of those different things, which sort of kept my interest going as project moved on, even though from a customer point of view, the features weren't flowing very fast. In some bad ways, there was quite a bit more changing behind the scenes, and I think that in some ways it's been frustrating with the amount of effort that was put into project that never really saw the light of day as far as a customer was concerned. They didn't necessarily see any changes when things like, rather than 4 databases, you now had just a single database, and instead of a single database, you just had rows in the SharePoint content database. All of those things were work and caused some support churn, and we needed to know how those worked, but they didn't really surface anything different from the customer perspective. In some cases, they probably had a negative effect from what the customer saw, just in terms of some of the reliances on SharePoint were sort of constraining project in ways that if you'd have had a blank sheet of paper and wanted to produce this application, you wouldn't have chosen those constraints necessarily. And in some ways, I often think for the client possibly, as well as for Project Server and Project Online, if they hadn't been part of Office and for Project Server part of SharePoint, would they have ever been something that Project could have spun off at some point if they decided those markets weren't really big enough for them to stay interested in them? Obviously where they're headed at the moment with Planner and work management, task management, it touches a lot more people than perhaps Project and Project Server ever did. So I can see it now being more interest to Microsoft where those things are going in terms of work management and how AI can play into those kind of things, compared to, they've got no real interest in PPM as a specific niche area anymore. And I think that's in some way that's liberating for people like you and the partner community, in that you haven't got this fear that you're going to build this feature and then Microsoft are going to come along and build that feature and take your market away. Which is all, when I worked for a partner, I think we sort of used to describe it as you're grabbing the lion by the tail. It's like you're benefiting by adding value to what they're doing, but if they ever decide to add that value themselves, then the lion's turned around and eaten you.
Microsoft, build the best that you can, make it, here's all the things that the clients want, here's things we'd like to see, here's some ideas, and just build it, right? And then we'll support it, we'll launch it out. Because when you get down to the customer level, when you get down to solving problems of it, no matter what the organization, Microsoft or other big companies contend on, they can't get down to that level, right? In fact, this is an interesting point of the Frontier company, because it's 6,000 forward deployed engineers that are Microsoft engineers, but realistically, they don't know the business, right? And I think this is where any of the partners, for the most part, weren't so much worried about their capabilities being eaten by Microsoft, so much as not having the evolution of the product to be able to move on. Now it's super exciting. I think we went from 450 requested features for Planner. Almost none of them were ever implemented from the Planner product team. And now we're at a point, and all the other partners are at a point where they're like, oh, we could just pick these up and do them ourselves, and we're not limited by architecture in that regard. I think that's one of the interesting, because from a partner side, I think most of the partners would be happy just building on an innovative, continuously evolving, AI driven, capability that's still branded Microsoft. I think everybody's happy to build it themselves too. I think that's one of the interesting things about this community in general, is that they adapt, and they're also curious, right? Is that they're curious about the technology, and their focus is, all right, how do we make it so that the organizations that we serve are able to use the best tech that whether we build it or whether we say, hey, this isn't the best one's right here, we'll deploy it for you.
It's interesting times at the moment. It's been quite liberating when you're using third-party software and it doesn't quite work how you want it to, then you're stuck unless they happen to improve it next time round. But the stuff I've been sort of building myself, it's like, yeah, it'd be nice if it did this. And, within probably hours, it does do that, because it's got the capabilities to do that. And again, it's liberating, but also very dangerous. I mean, obviously, if I'm only doing it for my own entertainment to some extent, but it is something that probably does need a sort of a level of control on it as well, in terms of where you end up in terms of the complexity of it. And, are you really the right people to be writing software? I'm not. But if it's just for myself, it's not a problem. But, I wouldn't sort of store my bank details in it and put it up on the web or whatever.
Well, and this one, it's one of those, like Darius Modi is saying, that you don't need to be a software developer in that regard, and all the different layers of it are going to be built. Scott Hanselman and Mark Rusinovich. So two Microsoft legends, and to me they're amazing. But Mark had one of the closing keynotes of Build talking about the layers of abstraction, right? So when you hear Anthropic and OpenAI saying you don't need to have developers build it because even the security will be baked in. it's really fascinating, and seeing what Mark and Scott talk about as they break down to, okay, what's one level below that? What's one and getting down to how does it actually work? Where can it actually break? How can it be? How can it be tricked or broken in a way that um, that can put the organization at risk? But on the flip side, they're showing these amazing things where they're building out robotic physical robots, and a server and the software and the reasoning behind it in an hour, and have it able to perform a function that would have taken months before to any time before now to be able to implement.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that looks like in the project management space? Pivoting ahead, what do you see in terms of user built modules, or the speed at which we can create new capabilities, or meeting the customer needs in a way that wasn't ever possible?
I think that there's some great capabilities for automating a lot of the routine type stuff. The kind of stuff that perhaps would have been reporting in the past. I know some of the stuff you've shown me about sort of asking Pam to come up with what your most at risk projects are, or whatever it might be, and it's very useful to have AI add some of those kind of things on top, where you've almost got like a voice interaction with your portfolio to understand sort of where it's going. I think part of the challenge I've seen with some of the AI stuff is around keeping the context of what it is you're asking. And I think that's probably something that's becoming less of an issue as the size of the context increases. Although, with that increased context size comes potentially increased costs as well. And I saw something yesterday on LinkedIn about token anxiety. There's a new thing where people are having to account for all the tokens they're using, and having to decide, is this really worth throwing away so many tokens on it? But I think that whole thing where I think PPM in a way can be managed using AI, but it's like, does it still keep the context across everything that you're looking after? Because I think sometimes the software that we've used in the past, whether it's sort of some of the portfolio features in project, I think were some of the most sort of fun things that I've worked on in terms of how they work and what have you. They were probably also a feature that sold project and project online very well, but how often they were used once the software was sold, not so sure. But again, it is those kind of things where you've got decisions made as to these things will support our business, they will support our business goals, this is the direction we want to go in, and making sure that any AI solution you're putting on top of those keeps that context up front as well. I've just put a couple of dozen pictures up into my WordPress media thing, put them into a decent order, add some words to them in the kind of way that I'd do it, and it at least gets the draft up there, and then it puts the draft there. I can go in and I can change stuff around and correct the words or whatever, and it'll set up a publishing schedule as well. And this is like in the Claude desktop app, but after you've done that a few times, it loses its way and forgets what it's supposed to be doing. And even though it said, once that's published, I'll go back in and change the publish date to November 2025 when you took the photos. Of course, it never does, because it forgets to do that, and it sort of loses the context of it. So I think there's something to be said in some ways about software like Project Server, Project Online, that usually worked exactly as it should do, and was worked in a repeatable way. and gave you a result that you could always expect. And I think that's where the control needs to be sort of kept somewhere on top of the AI, that it still has the right guardrails. And I know, and it's not just project management, obviously, but the guardrails are important. We've seen from the recent sort of escapes from OpenAI, going after Hugging Face and things like that, where if you don't tell it you can't do something or you shouldn't do something, then it's got no reason not to try to find back doors and go and do things that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to do.
So this brings up a really interesting, because I think the context space is something we've spent a lot of time on, because to your point, it's central to making this really usable, useful. We've built in a collective context. So you talk about what you do with Claude, what you do with ChatGPT, what you do with Copilot, and you're typing in information, you're prompting it, you've got your own context, you may give it access to other RAG and folders and other thing, or may have graph search. And what we do is we actually have it as a focused context that is also, again, it's a collective context. And that is to say that the team works on that same information. And we've got project data, portfolio data, financials, resourcing, that it's focusing, and everybody gets that same response no matter what, because the weight isn't put on the model to come up and figure out what the answer is. The model is orchestrating and running a query off a very specific data set. Then when we get into other things, like let's upload project documents or have lots of engineering schematics and financials, market analysis, market competition, is really focusing it so that you select the things that are included so it doesn't pull in everything. And you could absolutely have it and let the models try and figure it out. But to your point about about the token side, FinOps is becoming huge, because people aren't able to figure out how much their tokens are going to cost. And then if you have it searching even your internal universe of data, that's a huge cost just for trying to find and understand the information. So when we use things like the graph search, or when we build out through through Foundry, through Microsoft Foundry, or through WorkIQ, we have it chunked and broken down so that the tough work of getting that context out and focused and specific as much as possible is done. And then what happens is that whichever model we're using at that time is able to call it and use it. I ask a question, I get an answer. How many projects do we have? Here's how many projects. As opposed to go ahead and update all tasks across all of these projects, this subset that has, that has this information. And that information can be loaded in from documentation, from meeting minutes and transcripts and things like that directly into the system, so that you've got that automation. But it's very, as much as possible, it's focusing the right information and enabling the system to take action off of that. I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head, because that's really the key in having a successful use of AI on top of project data, on top of project online type of data.
Yeah. I think there's a danger that AI can do an awful lot of stuff, but why use AI to do something that's going to cost you 100 times more using AI than it would have done to do it the old way, if you like.
It's interesting because it seems like some teams are forgetting about core technologies that can greatly improve the outcomes. What's your favorite features? What's your favorite things? It sounded like there were a couple of things were exciting when you first saw them, or when you were first using them across the space on the project side. What are the what were the ones that were the biggest breakthroughs, the most interesting ones that you worked on?
I mean, so going back to the sort of server days, I think the OLAP reporting was really interesting. I mean, not just because it could break in a million different ways. And I forget how many blog posts I put together that had, and here is another way, another error you might see when you're trying to build an OLAP queue with all the various different components that were involved. I think just that whole sort of way of reporting was quite good. Obviously, when Project Online came across that came along, that wasn't an option that made the journey, so to speak. So then OData came into being sort of over there and added some extra challenges in terms of the speed of getting hold of that data. But the portfolio stuff was probably one of my favorite features. Again, I mentioned that earlier on. That was just the the math behind that and everything else. And in fact, I produced a version of that same stuff that, well, a couple of things. I put together a while ago a Power Platform sort of based thing that would do the same kind of work as that. But then I also, in Excel, using Copilot, as well as to Microsoft, I rebuilt that in Excel with Copilot and coming up with the same kind of results. So that was just found that an interesting thing. Although whether that is the right way to manage portfolios these days, I think that was some of the comments I got back when I posted that that's all very well doing it that way, but that's not how we do it these days. So okay.
Honestly, but it's first of all, it was awesome to see that you had done that, because that was one of it was a fascinating and interesting use case of Excel with Copilot to rebuild the portfolio optimizer. And to me, that whole UMT acquisition or integration into there was one of the most interesting. And for us, it was exciting because you've got all these features. Now you can see your optimized portfolio. You can now, again, whether or not people use the same things, what we find is the feeders might be different, the different calculations, your own internal algorithms, but that prioritization, it's the same thing. What you have, what you force in, what you force out. If the CEO says you're going to use, that this one's in no matter what, or this one's out no matter what, all of that's real life, and being able to say, okay, these are our most important projects and priorities, and have that, really listed in there. That was super unique, and to bring that into project data so that you've got, this is our approved portfolio. To me, the UMT, the capabilities that came along with that were amazing. And I think to your point, a lot of people didn't know about them or didn't have time to use them or learn them.
I think the big part of it for me as well wasn't just the sort of the technology side of it, but to make it work, you needed to get the right people in the room to agree what those priorities should be. And that was the biggest part of it, was, and perhaps that was the part that some companies were missing, but just coming up with the answers that tool needed to work on was just so valuable for an organization. What is it we're really in business to do? Is sort of it makes you ask some tricky questions. And I think that was a favorite of mine. And I think from a technology perspective, I was very impressed with Planner when the team started building Planner. I'm talking now about basic plans, not Project for the Web and the premium plans. For me, it showed potential that they could deliver if they didn't have the sort of constraints of sitting on top of a platform that held them back. And at one point, I suspect that architecture was destined to be the back end for a future project server, whatever it might have been called. And then Power Platform came along, and the Common Data Service, and it feels as though they were sort of told to use that, or thought, oh, we'll use this and we'll get some stuff for free. And you do get some stuff for free. Yeah, and and it is very powerful. It is a good platform, there's no doubt about that. But in terms of what it did to project, it's like you've got this front end and you're forced to use this back end. Oh, and at the same time, we'd like our project managers to all be able to edit the same project at the same time. So you've got that issue to deal with as well. How quickly does that data get persisted back into the back end when it's got to make all those decisions going through? In some ways, it held project back a little bit. And it would be interesting to see where the unification ends up, because I don't think we're there yet. There keep being posts that seem to be saying this new unified planner, but it's sort of, most of it just feels as if it's just front end at the moment, and there's still sort of two different things sitting behind it.
Like architecture, you can't cleanly get reporting off of both sides at the same time.
I think one of the other things with the basic plans that I found a lot of fun to work on was the Graph API, and being able to sort of interact very easily with planner data through that. Particularly, I mean, the thing I played around with a lot was the message center integration, which sort of came up with a prototype of, okay, you could take the message center posts using one API and push them into planner. And the admin team took that on board and created something that was far better than I'd ever written. It's still out there today.
So if you were to build out now kind of a, your dream version of Microsoft Project, right? If you had, you could pick any platform, you could pick any technologies, you had no limits on what you could build or do. What would that look like? What would you have in this future Brian Smith perfect version of project?
It would probably look like something very similar to Project Server in some ways, in that I still think there's a huge value in the project client, and there are some projects that you're only ever going to be able to manage using the capabilities that something like the project client has got. But the rest of the organization needs to have some kind of visibility into all that data. So, behind it, you need to have that data sort of available, particularly for things like resource scheduling or those kind of things. So I think it would almost be the same as Project Server, but make sure you're not compromising that back end by having to have it fit into, say, Power Platform or SharePoint or whatever. If you don't have the constraints at the back end and you can just do what you need to do it. And I feel in some ways that was probably where Project was headed when they started work on Planner, but took a side turn along the way, and distraction of Power Platform. But again, it's that's sort of coming from my perspective and a little bit of my history as well. I think if you were building or looking at what the AI capabilities were these days, you might structure it in a slightly different way, because perhaps there is a better way of doing things than the Microsoft Project for these hundreds of thousand line types of projects. Yeah. But again, it's losing the context would be my concern with some of those things. Adrian Jenkins, I mean, he knows the project client inside out, back to front, every feature, 100 times more than I do. And he'd sit down with perhaps a new engineer on the engineering team, and they'd say, well, how can a customer use a project plan that's got 100,000 rows? How can they ever sort of navigate through that? And Adrian would quickly show them how views can be created and tables and everything else. And you're never really working on 100,000 rows all at once, but the client was built in such a way that it could filter down and show you just what you needed to do and what you needed when you needed it. Perhaps the development team aren't big users of the product. It introduces some challenges there, in that they sort of knew roughly how project was working. But I mean, like me, if I'm doing some training for our support team or whatever, my project plan will have probably 50 tasks in it, and it will work perfectly. But it's not the real world. I think when you start getting into the real world, it gets a little bit busier.
That's fascinating. I think my first project plan in Microsoft Project was putting together a barbecue, right? 50 lines. We did a deployment of Project Central in 2000. It was so difficult because you had to do the Windows Server install and the SQL Server install and the application, and exactly in the right order. And each one had different admin rights, and it took us forever to try and figure out, how to deploy. But it's interesting because what it sounds like you're saying is, and it's really insightful, is that the need is for still the ability to have multi-thousand line plans with that level of rigor, but have the visibility and the simplicity to be able to chop it and be able to use it, right? And that's something that experts in project desktop in particular have done for years. And there some folks have trained on that, and they're master schedulers who have built out these plans. They know exactly how to do it. You ask anybody else in the organization, they don't necessarily, because they get the reports and they get the outputs of it. But one or two people in the org who can put together, the plan for building out your new NFL stadium, or a data center, or a school, or a hospital, where the interdependencies and the amount of coordination is so significant that you don't just put it in a work management tool or into Excel, as powerful as Excel, but to have that simplified view of that big plan. And I think that's the thing that's missing with project going away is
Yeah.
there's either work management and it's so easy and you can throw AI on it, but it's more personalized. How do I save 4 hours a week? Or there's enterprise that's just for major initiatives, major construction projects, but it's not built for the users and it's not built for AI yet, even though it's got all the data. So I think right now we've got, from what I think we've got a gap from what Project Online has been able to do for all these years.
Yeah. Obviously Project Server is still going to be around for a little while yet, and I can see that for some people the migration back to that is not necessarily a bad move. There's lots of downsides to it in terms of who's hosting that stuff, because a lot of companies aren't really or shouldn't be in that business. If you want it available like Project Online, then do you have the right IT infrastructure yourself to be able to host something? But there are hosts out there that will put up Project Server for you to sort of run that. But I think it's. I know some take the view that it's a step backwards, and that product is not seeing any changes in forever. But if it works and does what you need it to do, then to some extent, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I think we're seeing that as exactly that, which is, there's organizations, really advanced organizations who are saying like, oh my goodness, CEO mandate, we're going AI first on everything. And they're still going like, okay, now we're going to go back to Project Server, which, it still, it fills the gap. I think exactly as you're saying is the architecture being 13 years old, in order to move them, in order to meet where the rest of Microsoft, right? Where the rest of Fabric IQ and Work IQ and all and AI Foundry and all these other spaces is really a need to move the data to a framework and the capability to a framework that covers those things that we've been trying to solve with Project for 13 years, right? Concurrent editing, the issues with queue jobs and things like that. All the things that, from a support perspective, I'm sure you've gotten a million calls on. Those things are still in Project Server.
Yeah. I mean, the queue was a source of a lot of work for me in the support days. And it's funny as well that a lot of the things that were in sort of Project Server, when they moved up to Project Online, there needed to be some database changes because there wasn't a lot of referential integrity built into Project Server database structures. And potentially if a queue job failed halfway through, you could end up with some remnants and you'd have to go into databases and hack certain things out to get it to work again. And obviously in Project Online, you can't do that as easily. You have to sort of get special people who have allowed access directly to the database to go in and create a particular commandlet that will go in and make those edits into the database, and 10 people have to sign off on it or whatever it is. So a lot of referential integrity was added to Project Online. Now, the good thing is that also got into Project Server as well. So it helped with those queue jobs, which meant that they either worked or they failed, and everything was put back if it failed. The downside of a lot of those was it introduced a lot more constraints on the database side, that you'd sometimes have to put locks onto rows that you weren't necessarily locking before. And if you put in too many locks on those rows, then it might lock the table. And if you're in a multi-tenant database, locking the table is not something you really want to do for very long. Yeah. So it gets the SharePoint people very unhappy if the project is starting to sort of push some locks onto their tables.
Brian, a couple quick final questions. We have a little bit of trivia. Actually, a long list, which I think we'll save for a pint in San Francisco next time. When did Microsoft Project first get released? What year?
I was looking at my Gantt chart, which had all of these on it. Where was that?
Wow, no cheating. This is a trivia question.
It was around about 2012, was it?
No, Microsoft Project. So the original version of Project.
Version 1 on DOS.
Yeah.
84. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Which is a funny thing, is the earliest date that you can schedule for calculations was January 1st, 1984. So you can't go back to 1900 and things like that in your plans for calculations. When this is another kind of trick one, but when what was the last day that you could put in your schedule as a reference for the last date that you could put in a finish date for calculation?
I think it moved out to 2199.
2149.
Right, 2149, yeah. Yeah, I think they pushed it out like another 100 years or something, wasn't it? Because I think it was 2049 at one point and it was pushed out to 2149.
Oh, how many projects can you have in your site collection in Project Online? What was the cap for projects?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if there was a limit of the projects as such, because you could have any number of projects in project, but if you had sites related to those projects, then SharePoint would start complaining. I don't know what those lists are. I think it's 5,000 for items in a list, but I think it's probably a lot lower than that for sites in a site collection.
There was 5,000 in the SharePoint list, and then that got expanded to 25 million or something like that. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure where it is now. I think the official numbers, it was 30,000 projects per PWA and 2,000 sites per site collection. That was the
right. Interesting piece of trivia. I mean, a lot of people, when Project Online came along and your quota was it 25 gig or was it 20 gig? I can't remember, but
25, yeah.
And people were saying, my project server database is already 200 gigabytes. How am I ever going to use Project Online? But it wasn't necessarily counting the same data. I mean, firstly, I think the Project Online quota didn't include indexes, and there were certain other things it didn't include as well that would be in a project server database. But the reason for the low limit was really about how easily a SharePoint farm could fail over if there was ever a problem. And if you think of how SharePoint works and how project works, it's just a lot of little things that are stored in other things, and very few of them are related to each other. I mean, you could have some kind of metadata linking them, but that was just about it. So basically, if you needed to fail over, you're moving all these little things over, and it doesn't matter if you're halfway through and things come back online and you move them all back again. Project was very different because you had projects which had to have tasks, which had to have assignments, which had to have resources, and it was one sort of big blob of something. So the database couldn't get beyond a size where SharePoint could comfortably move that to some kind of backup, whether it was within the same region or even across to a totally different geography if there was a particular problem. So the limits of, which I think we would they would allow a customer to grow up to about 100 gig. So you could extend to 50, and we could do that in support. But it was really about the how easily SharePoint could fail over.
Yeah.
Was what was holding that back.
What message or what would you want to say to project users, project online users, project server users?
It's been a wonderful journey. I think it will be continuing. Obviously, Project Desktop's not going away anytime soon, neither's Project Server. So if you still need those capabilities, then they're out there for you.
As we shift into this agentic era and this new way of managing projects from built on what Project Server and Project Online had created and bringing it into the future. And Brian, I think on behalf of the user community, the partner community, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's Pam, Quantum PMO's AI agent. Every episode, we retire a legacy feature and show what's next. Subscribe and follow. See you soon.